When did you expose your bully? Only to find 100 times darker. I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw another story from Cannon showing off his latest party. The whole school knew Cannon was supposedly this tragic orphan living with his sick grandmother, but his lifestyle told a completely different story. He had new Jordan sneakers every week and threw ragers at his house whenever he got suspended for beating up freshmen. Cannon had been terrorizing our school for 3 years straight. He'd steal lunch money like it was still the 90s and shove kids into lockers for looking at him wrong. Teachers gave him sympathy passes because of his difficult home situation, but we all knew something didn't add up. How could an orphan living with a poor, sick grandma afford a PS5 and designer clothes? My best friend Andrea was obsessed with figuring out Cannon's deal. She'd screenshot all his Instagram stories where he flexed his gaming setup and expensive sneakers. She noticed patterns like how he only threw parties on weekends, and how certain rooms in his house never appeared in any photos. The biggest mystery was his grandmother's room, which always had the door shut during parties. The story about Cannon's grandma was that she was bedridden and needed constant care. Teachers would excuse his absences, saying he had to take care of her. But Andrea pointed out that if she was so sick, how could Cannon leave her alone during his all-night gaming sessions? And why did nobody ever see her or even hear her during the massive parties? Andrea started investigating like she was a detective. She talked to kids who'd been to Cannon's parties, and they all said the same thing. The grandma's door at the end of the hallway was always locked and had a "Do Not Disturb" sign. Music would be blasting and kids would be everywhere except near that door. Cannon would lose it if anyone even walked too close to that part of the house. Last Friday, Cannon got suspended again for slamming a sophomore's head into a water fountain. By that night, he was posting stories of him playing Marvel Rivals and inviting people over. Andrea saw her chance and decided she was finally going to solve the grandmother mystery. She convinced me to come with her, but I chickened out at the last minute. I stayed home refreshing Instagram while Andrea went to the party alone. She texted me updates about how packed it was and how Cannon was showing off some new chain he'd bought. Around midnight, she sent a message saying she was going to make her move. She'd waited until Cannon was distracted by some beer pong tournament in the garage. Andrea snuck down the hallway toward the forbidden door. She texted that the handle was locked, but she'd learned how to pick simple locks from YouTube. My hands were sweating as I waited for her next message. 5 minutes passed before she texted that she was inside the room and it was completely dark. My phone started buzzing with a FaceTime call from Andrea. I answered and could barely see anything on the screen. She was whispering and using her phone's flashlight to look around. The room looked normal at first with a bed and dresser, but something was off. The bed was perfectly made, like nobody had slept in it for months. Andrea kept searching and pointing her camera at different parts of the room. There were no medicine bottles on the nightstand, and no wheelchair or walker anywhere. The closet was empty except for some dusty coat hangers. She opened the dresser drawers, and they were all empty too. There was literally no sign that anyone lived in that room. "There's nobody here," Andrea whispered into the phone. "There's nothing here at all." She moved the camera around more frantically now. The room had thick curtains blocking the windows, and a weird smell like old paint. There were no photos or personal items anywhere. It looked like a movie set of a bedroom rather than a place where a sick grandmother would live. Andrea was explaining how the dust on everything proved nobody had been in there for ages when we both heard it. Through the phone, I could hear footsteps pounding down the hallway. Andrea spun around and pointed her camera at the door just as it flew open. Cannon stood there with his face twisted in rage. "What are you doing?" Cannon screamed so loud it made my phone speaker crackle. Andrea tried to back away, but Cannon stepped into the room and grabbed the door handle. The last thing I saw was his face getting closer to the camera before Andrea's phone went flying. I heard Andrea scream, and then a loud slam. The FaceTime call dropped, and I was hitting Andrea's name over and over, but it kept going straight to voicemail. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely type as I sent text after text asking if she was okay. I tried calling again and again, but nothing went through. I kept refreshing Instagram to see if she'd post anything, but her profile stayed quiet. 20 minutes passed with no word from Andrea, and I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bike from the garage and started pedaling toward Cannon's house even though I was scared out of my mind. The whole ride there, my legs felt like jelly, and I kept checking my phone at every stop sign. When I got to Cannon Street, I could hear music still blasting from his house. Kids were hanging out on the front lawn with red cups, and nobody seemed to know anything had happened. I locked my bike to a street sign and started walking around the house looking for Andrea. Some kids recognized me and waved, but I just kept searching through the crowd. I checked the backyard where people were playing beer pong and the garage where Cannon usually held court. No sign of Andrea anywhere, and my stomach was in knots. I asked a few people if they'd seen her, but most were too drunk to give useful answers. Finally, some kid who was sitting on the front steps said he saw Cannon dragging a girl toward the door about 15 minutes ago. He said Cannon looked mad, and the girl was holding her arm weird. My phone buzzed, and I almost dropped it, pulling it out of my pocket. The text was from a number I didn't recognize, but it said it was Andrea using someone's phone. She said she was walking home and her wrist hurt bad, and Cannon had smashed her phone after shoving her out. I typed back asking where exactly she was, but she said she'd already made it most of the way home. I ran back to my bike and started racing toward Andrea's house, which was about 10 minutes away. My legs burned from pedaling so hard, but I didn't care. When I turned onto her street, I could see her sitting on her front steps under the porch light. Even from down the block, I could tell something was wrong with how she was holding her left arm. I dropped my bike on her lawn and ran up to where she was sitting. Her wrist was already swollen up and turning purple, and she was trying not to cry. She looked up at me, and I could see she was more mad than scared, which was typical Andrea. She said Cannon had grabbed her arm and twisted it hard when he caught her in the room. Then he dragged her through the party while people just watched and threw her out the front door. He'd taken her phone and thrown it on the ground and stomped on it until the screen shattered. She said he was screaming that she'd regret ever coming near his house again. Andrea tried to move her wrist and winced so bad I thought she might throw up. But then she said we had to figure out how to prove what she saw in that empty room. She was more determined than ever to expose Cannon's lies about having a sick grandma. We went inside and Andrea's parents were already asleep, so we had to be quiet. I got ice from the freezer and wrapped it in a dish towel for her wrist. We sat at her kitchen table and went through everything she'd seen in that room. She kept saying the dust on everything proved nobody had been in there for months at least. The bed looked like it came from a furniture store display with how perfect it was made. No medical stuff anywhere, even though Cannon's grandma was supposed to be super sick and bedridden. Andrea said the room smelled weird too, like old paint or maybe mothballs. We stayed up until 3 in the morning making a list of everything suspicious about Cannon's story. Andrea kept saying we needed to find proof that his grandma either never existed or had been gone for a long time. She thought maybe we could check public records or find old social media posts. I kept looking at her wrist getting darker and more swollen and telling her we should wake up her parents. But Andrea said she didn't want to make a big deal until we had more evidence about Cannon's lies. When I finally biked home, the sun was starting to come up and I felt sick about what had happened. The next morning at the school, I walked in and could already hear people talking about Friday night. Cannon had gotten there early and was telling everyone his version of what happened. He was saying Andrea broke into his house and tried to steal stuff while his poor grandma was sleeping. He said he caught her red-handed going through his grandma's dresser looking for money or jewelry. Kids were eating it up because Cannon was popular, and Andrea was just the weird girl who took everything too seriously. By second period, someone had written burglar on Andrea's locker in black marker. I tried to clean it off, but it just smeared and made it worse. Kids were calling her a thief and a creep when she walked down the hallway. Some girl said Andrea was probably jealous of Cannon having nice stuff and wanted to rob him. I tried telling people what really happened, but nobody wanted to hear it from me. Cannon's story made more sense to them than Andrea just being curious about an empty room. At lunch, Andrea showed me her wrist, which had turned dark purple, and she could barely move her fingers. The swelling had gotten worse overnight, and I could see she was in real pain even though she tried to hide it. I told her we had to go to the nurse right away before it got any worse. She didn't want to at first, but I basically dragged her to the nurse's office. The nurse took one look at Andrea's wrist and said she needed to see a doctor immediately. The nurse called Andrea's parents and told them to take her to urgent care right away. Andrea's mom showed up 20 minutes later looking worried and asking what happened. I helped Andrea to the car while she held her wrist against her chest. The whole drive to urgent care, Andrea kept saying she was fine, but I could tell she was hurting bad. Her wrist had gotten even bigger and darker since we'd left school. At urgent care, the waiting room was packed with people, but the nurse at the desk took one look at Andrea's wrist and got us back to a room fast. Andrea's older sister Aubrey works as a nurse at the hospital next door, and she came over on her break when her mom texted her. Aubrey walked into the exam room, and her face went from worried to mad real quick when she saw Andrea's wrist. She started taking pictures with her phone and told Andrea this was assault, and they needed to file a report. The doctor came in and started examining Andrea's wrist, moving it different ways while Andrea tried not to cry. He sent her for x-rays, and when they came back, he showed us on the computer screen where the ligaments were stretched and damaged. He said it was a grade 2 sprain that would need a brace for at least 2 weeks and maybe physical therapy after. The nurse brought in this black brace that went from Andrea's hand halfway up her arm. They wrote up all the medical paperwork with official diagnosis codes and printed copies for us. The doctor said he was documenting everything, including the cause of injury that Andrea had told him about. Andrea's dad showed up at the hospital looking ready to fight someone. Both her parents were saying they should call the police right now and press charges against Cannon. Andrea started begging them not to, saying it would make everything worse at the school. She kept saying she wanted to handle it through the school first and see if they would actually do something this time. Her parents weren't happy, but they agreed to give the school a chance first. We spent the whole weekend organizing everything we had. Andrea typed up exactly what happened using her left hand since her right was in the brace. I helped her put together a folder with the medical records, the doctor's notes, and timestamps from my phone showing when everything happened Friday night. Sunday night, I couldn't sleep thinking about going back to the school. Monday morning, we went straight to the main office before first period. The secretary told us Assistant Principal Lois Green could see us in 10 minutes. We sat in those uncomfortable plastic chairs watching kids walk by, staring at Andrea's brace. Green called us into her office and asked what happened. Andrea showed her the medical paperwork, and I backed up her story about Friday night. Green's whole attitude changed when she saw the official medical documentation. She said this changed everything about the incident, and she couldn't ignore assault with medical evidence. She pulled up Cannon's file on her computer and started scrolling through his attendance records. Her face got more serious as she kept reading. She said Cannon had missed 43 days this year, claiming he needed to care for his sick grandmother. She printed out the attendance records and highlighted all the absences. Green said she was opening a formal investigation into both the assault and the grandmother situation. She gave us case numbers and said she'd be contacting Cannon's listed guardian immediately. We thought maybe Cannon would lay low after getting called to the office, but he did the opposite. That afternoon, he started posting Instagram stories making fun of snitches and people who can't mind their own business. His friends were commenting snake emojis and saying Andrea's name. One story showed a picture of a rat with, "Some people need to learn to stay in their lane," written over it. Kids were screenshotting the stories and sending them to Andrea all day. By lunch, there were dozens of posts and comments targeting her. Some were calling her a snitch. Others were saying worse stuff about what should happen to her. I started screenshotting every single post and comment. Andrea and I sat in the library during lunch organizing them into a folder on my laptop. We labeled each screenshot with the username, time, and date. Andrea was trying to act like it didn't bother her, but I could see her hands shaking as she helped me organize the evidence. Green called us back to her office after school and told us a social worker named Tyrone Stone had been assigned to investigate Cannon's living situation. She said Stone would need to verify if Cannon actually had a guardian and if the grandmother story was real. The problem was that legally, they had to give Cannon 24 hours notice before doing a home visit. She said Stone would contact Cannon's listed guardian phone number today to schedule the visit for tomorrow. Tuesday was rough because everyone knew something was going down with Cannon. Kids were picking sides and the hallways felt tense. At lunch, I was sitting with Andrea in the cafeteria when Cannon walked straight up to our table. He leaned down close to my face and said, "I better keep my mouth shut if I knew what was good for me." His breath smelled like energy drinks and his fists were clenched. Before I could even respond, Rafael Cardenas, the security guard, was there grabbing Cannon's shoulder. Rafael had been watching from across the cafeteria and came over fast when he saw Cannon approach us. He told Cannon to come with him right now and started walking him toward the office. Cannon kept looking back at me with this look that made my stomach hurt. Rafael filed an official report about the intimidation attempt and added it to Cannon's growing file of violations. Green called my parents to let them know about the threat and said they were taking it seriously. She said this was another violation that would be part of the investigation. My mom wanted to pick me up early, but I said I was okay to finish the day. After last period ended, I was walking with Andrea to the front entrance when this older guy came up to us and said he was Porter Webb, Cannon's next-door neighbor. Porter looked like he was in his 40s with gray hair and work boots covered in paint. He said he'd lived next to Cannon's house for 5 years and was sick of all the parties every weekend. Andrea's eyes got wide when Porter said he'd never once seen any old lady at that house, not even through the windows or in the yard. Porter pulled out his phone and started showing us videos from his Ring doorbell camera that faced Cannon's driveway. The first video showed kids streaming into Cannon's house last Friday night with cases of beer and speakers. Another video from 2 weeks ago had Cannon carrying a new TV into the house by himself at 2 in the morning. Porter scrolled through dozens of clips from different parties, and there was never any sign of someone old or sick living there. He said the only person he ever saw was Cannon coming and going at weird hours with shopping bags and takeout food. Andrea asked Porter if she could send herself some of the videos, and he agreed because he wanted someone to finally do something about the noise. We sat on the school steps while Andrea forwarded the videos to her email and started searching public records on her phone. She found the county property website and typed in Cannon's address to see who owned the house. The listing showed it was a rental property owned by some company, and the current lease started 14 months ago. Andrea's hands were shaking as she showed me the screen because the lease was only in Cannon's name with no other adults listed. Porter said that made sense because he'd never seen any adults sign for packages or talk to delivery drivers at that house. Andrea took screenshots of everything and said we needed to show this to Green right away, but the office was already closed for the day. The next morning, we got to the school early and went straight to Green's office with all the evidence printed out. Green looked at the security videos on Andrea's laptop, and her face got more serious with each one. She studied the lease documents and said this was major evidence, but they still needed official confirmation about the grandmother. Green made a phone call right there and told Tyrone Stone about the new information we'd found. She put him on speaker, and Stone said he'd bring a police officer for the scheduled welfare check that afternoon. After we left Green's office, kids were already talking about how Cannon's Instagram had gone private overnight. Some of his friends said he'd been at his house all morning moving boxes and bags into a U-Haul truck. One kid showed us a Snapchat story from Cannon's friend that showed him throwing garbage bags full of stuff into a dumpster behind the grocery store. Andrea tried to check Cannon's Instagram, but he'd blocked both of us and removed all his followers except for a few close friends. By lunch, everyone knew something big was happening because Cannon wasn't at the school and teachers were whispering in the hallways. Around 2 o'clock, Stone texted Green that he and an officer were at Cannon's house for the welfare check. Andrea and I sat in the library pretending to study, but really just waiting for updates about what was happening. An hour later, Green called us to her office and said Cannon had refused to let them inside the house. She said Cannon stood in the doorway claiming his grandmother was too sick for visitors and threatened to call a lawyer if they tried to come in. The officer couldn't force entry without a warrant or immediate danger, but he documented everything in his report. Stone told Green the officer noticed there was no medical equipment visible through the windows and no handicap ramp or grab bars that you'd expect for an elderly person. The officer also saw that all the furniture looked new and there were gaming posters on every wall, which seemed weird for a house with a sick grandma. That night, Andrea's parents decided to hire a lawyer after hearing about everything that had happened. The lawyer was this woman who specialized in child welfare cases, and she started digging into public records right away. Within 2 days, she found an obituary online for a woman named Margaret Brennan, who had the same last name as Cannon. The obituary said Margaret died 14 months ago at age 73 after a long illness. The timeline matched exactly when Cannon started telling everyone about his sick grandmother, who needed constant care. Andrea's lawyer also found that Margaret's address before she died was listed as the same house where Cannon now lived alone. She pulled death certificate records that confirmed Margaret Brennan died in hospice care with no immediate family listed except for a grandson. The lawyer said this proved Cannon had been living by himself since his actual grandmother died over a year ago. Back at the school that week, Cannon showed up angrier than I'd ever seen him before. He walked down the hallway slamming his fist into lockers so hard that he left dents in some of them. When a freshman accidentally bumped into him, Cannon grabbed the kid's backpack and threw it down the stairs. Teachers watched from their doorways, but nobody wanted to get involved while the investigation was happening. During chemistry class, Cannon sat behind me breathing heavy and muttering threats under his breath about snitches. Meanwhile, Andrea had been checking online marketplaces and found Cannon's accounts on StockX and Grailed where he was selling shoes and clothes. She showed me listings for Jordan 4s, Supreme hoodies, and PlayStation controllers, all posted by accounts with Cannon's username. The seller ratings showed he'd been doing this for over a year, with hundreds of sales totaling thousands of dollars. Andrea realized this was how Cannon had been paying rent and buying food without any adults around to support him. 3 days passed with Cannon getting more aggressive at the school, and I tried to avoid him by taking different routes between classes. During PE on Thursday, we were changing in the locker room when Cannon appeared behind me and grabbed my shirt with both hands. He slammed me against the lockers and his face was inches from mine while he hissed something about keeping my mouth shut. Before he could do anything else, 3 guys from the basketball team pulled him off and shoved him backward. The coach walked in right as Cannon was swinging at one of them and saw the whole thing. The coach grabbed Cannon by the arm and marched him straight to the office while the rest of us stood there catching our breath. Within an hour, Cannon got suspended for 3 days pending the investigation outcome, and Lois Green told Andrea and me that they finally had enough pattern evidence to take serious action. She showed us a folder with documented incidents going back months, including the water fountain assault, and now this attack on me. That same afternoon, Porter Webb went to the police station and filed a formal complaint about all the parties and noise violations at Cannon's house. He brought his security camera footage showing parties happening almost every weekend for the past year with no adults ever visible. The police issued citations that proved Cannon had been living unsupervised for over a year based on the dates and frequency of the violations. Porter also gave them a written statement about never seeing an elderly woman at the property in all his years living next door. 2 days later, Tyrone Stone came back to Cannon's house, but this time he had a court order for a welfare check based on all the accumulated evidence. The judge had signed it that morning after reviewing the medical records, police citations, and witness statements we'd provided. Cannon legally had to let them in or face immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. Andrea and I waited outside on the sidewalk as Tyrone, Lois Green, and 2 police officers walked up to Cannon's front door. Through the living room window, we could see Cannon pacing back and forth with his hands on his head. When they knocked, he took forever to answer, and we could see his tough guy act finally starting to crack. He opened the door and stood there for a minute arguing before one of the officers held up the court order. Cannon's shoulders dropped, and he stepped aside to let them all in. We watched through the window as they disappeared down the hallway toward that back bedroom. About 10 minutes passed before we saw Cannon slump onto his couch with his head in his hands. Andrea grabbed my arm when we saw one of the officers taking photos of the empty room. An hour later, they all came back outside, and Cannon was following them with tears running down his face. Tyrone Stone confirmed there was no grandmother and never had been based on what they found. The room was exactly as Andrea had described, with dust on everything and no sign anyone had lived there for months. They found old mail in a drawer addressed to Margaret Brennan with a date from over a year ago. Cannon broke down sobbing on his front steps while the officers documented everything for their report. The next morning, a man showed up at the school asking for Lois Green and introduced himself as Derek Woods, Cannon's older cousin. He was in his 30s and looked tired as he sat in Green's office explaining that he'd be taking temporary custody while they figured out Cannon's living situation. Derek had driven 6 hours after getting the call from social services about what they'd discovered. He told the administrators that Cannon's grandmother Margaret had actually died 14 months ago, and Cannon hid it to avoid going into foster care. Cannon had been forging her signature on the school documents and lying to everyone about taking care of her. Derek said Cannon was terrified of losing his independence and the house where he'd grown up with his grandma. He'd been collecting her social security checks through their joint bank account and selling stuff online to pay the bills. Derek looked exhausted as he explained how Cannon had blocked all the family members who tried to check on him after the funeral. Nobody realized he was living alone because he kept telling everyone his grandma was too sick for visitors. The school scheduled a disciplinary hearing for the following week, and Andrea and I got called to Green's office. She said we'd need to provide witness statements about both the assault in the locker room and all the intimidation that happened afterward. The hearing officer would review everything to determine what consequences Cannon would face beyond the criminal charges. Word spread through school faster than any rumor I'd ever seen before. By lunch, everyone knew the truth about Cannon's grandmother, and kids were shocked that he'd been living alone for over a year. Some kids felt bad for him losing his grandma and being so scared of foster care that he'd lie about it. Others were angry about all the years of bullying and said he didn't deserve any sympathy after terrorizing everyone. The tough guy who'd ruled the school through fear was suddenly just a scared kid who'd been abandoned and desperate. His crew of followers scattered and nobody wanted to be associated with him anymore. Even the teachers who'd given him sympathy passes looked uncomfortable when they realized how badly they'd been fooled. Cannon's whole image crumbled in less than 24 hours, and suddenly, everyone saw him differently. The hearing happened the next week in the conference room by the main office. Andrea walked in with her wrist still in a brace and sat down next to me at the long table. Lois Green was there with 2 other administrators I didn't recognize, and they had a stack of papers in front of them. Porter Webb came in wearing a button-down shirt and told them about all the parties he'd recorded on his security cameras over the past year. He showed them timestamps proving nobody was supervising Cannon and how loud the music got every weekend. Aubrey came next and explained Andrea's injury in medical terms, showing x-rays and doctor notes about the grade 2 sprain. I pulled out my phone and showed them all the screenshots of Cannon's Instagram threats and the snake emojis his friends posted about Andrea. The administrators looked at each page and made notes while Cannon sat at the other end of the table with Derek beside him. When it was Cannon's turn to talk, his voice cracked, and he admitted everything. He said his grandma Margaret died 14 months ago, and he'd been too scared to tell anyone because he didn't want to go into foster care. He forged her signature on the school papers and collected her social security checks to pay rent and bills. He started crying when he talked about how lonely it was living in that empty house and how he threw parties just to have people around. The panel members whispered to each other for a few minutes before announcing their decision. Cannon would transfer to the alternative school across town and had to see a counselor twice a week. He also had to pay all of Andrea's medical bills and do 100 hours of community service at the youth center. The criminal charges came a week later when the prosecutor's office filed assault charges for what he did to Andrea. Derek drove Cannon to the courthouse where they offered him something called a deferred judgment program. If he stayed out of trouble for a year and completed all his requirements, the charges would get dropped and wouldn't go on his permanent record. Andrea's wrist took forever to heal, and she had to do physical therapy exercises every day. She joined the school newspaper and started writing this article about recognizing signs when kids might be living without adults. She interviewed counselors and social workers about what to look for and how to help without making things worse. I felt terrible about not going with her that night to Cannon's party and kept apologizing every time I saw her. One day at lunch, she grabbed my hand and said she understood why I was scared and didn't blame me at all. She said facing Cannon alone made her realize how brave she could be, and maybe it happened the way it was supposed to. I started trying to be less of a coward after that, and actually stood up to some junior who was picking on a freshman in the hallway. Cannon moved into Derek's apartment and started going to Valley Alternative School on the other side of town. Kids from our school saw him working at the grocery store bagging groceries and stocking shelves in the evenings. He had to give most of his paycheck to Andrea's family for the medical bills, which took months to pay off. The school board had emergency meetings about updating their policies for checking on students' living situations. They added new rules about home visits and guardian verification, plus more cameras in the hallways and stricter punishments for bullying. Porter Webb started stopping by to check on Andrea and me after school sometimes. He'd bring cookies his wife made and ask how we were doing with everything. He said we did what adults should have done years ago, and he was proud of us for being brave enough to expose the truth. 3 months went by, and Andrea finally got her brace off for good. Her wrist was back to normal, and she could write and type without any pain. She started talking about wanting to study journalism in college and investigate bigger stories than just high school drama. She said this whole thing with Cannon taught her that sometimes the truth is hiding right in front of everyone, and it just takes someone willing to look closer to find it. Derek started bringing Cannon to the youth center on Saturdays for his community service hours, and I'd see them unloading sports equipment from Derek's truck when I biked past. Cannon was teaching little kids how to shoot basketballs and helping them with homework in the afternoons, actually being patient with them instead of his usual angry self. Derek told my mom at the grocery store that having structure and adults watching him was making Cannon act like a totally different person. Kids who Cannon used to shove into lockers started talking about what he did to them now that he wasn't around to hurt them anymore. The school counselor put up flyers for a support group that would meet every Wednesday after school in the library. I went to the first meeting and there were like 20 kids there, all telling stories about getting pushed around or having their stuff stolen by Cannon over the years. Andrea and I started hanging out way more after everything that happened, doing homework together at her house and going to movies on weekends. We'd laugh about being like those kid detectives from old books, except we actually solved a real mystery and got hurt doing it. One afternoon, the mailman delivered this official-looking envelope to Andrea's house from the court program Cannon was in. Inside was a handwritten letter where Cannon said he was sorry for grabbing her wrist and throwing her out of his house that night. Andrea read it 3 times, then folded it up and said she wasn't going to stay mad at him forever, because that wouldn't help anybody move on. The local newspaper people came to our school because Andrea's article about kids living without adults won some big journalism award for high schoolers. She got to give a speech at the awards ceremony about how schools need better ways to check if kids have real guardians and how to help them without just punishing them. I was walking through the cereal aisle at the grocery store 6 months after everything went down when I saw Cannon stocking boxes on the shelves. We looked at each other for a second, and he gave me this small nod, so I nodded back. Then we both just kept doing what we were doing without saying anything. Andrea got this big envelope in the mail with her acceptance letter to the journalism program at State University that she'd been wanting to go to since middle school. She kept saying that dealing with the whole Cannon situation showed her that finding out the truth about stuff was hard, but worth it even when things got messy. The school put in new cameras everywhere and made this whole system where teachers had to check on kids who missed too many days. They hired 2 more counselors and started doing these assemblies about bullying and what to do if you see someone getting hurt. Andrea and I still text each other every single day even though we go to different classes now. She sends me drafts of articles she's writing for the school paper, and I help her pick which photos to use. Sometimes we talk about that night at Cannon's house and how scared we both were, but mostly we just talk about normal stuff like homework and which teachers are annoying us. The hallways feel different now without Cannon around to make everyone nervous about getting shoved or having their lunch money taken. New kids don't even know who he was or why there's all these rules about checking on students' home situations. Porter still waves at me when I walk past his house, and sometimes he'll come out to ask how Andrea's doing with her writing. He brought us both gift cards to the bookstore for Christmas and said we did something important that grown-ups should have done a long time ago. Andrea's wrist doesn't hurt anymore, and she can write for hours without needing to ice it or take breaks. The physical therapy lady said it healed perfect, and there won't be any long-term problems from when Cannon twisted it. I stopped being such a chicken about stuff after seeing how brave Andrea was going into that room alone. When some older kid tried to take a 7th grader's phone in the bathroom, I actually said something instead of just walking away like I would have before. The alternative school people must be doing something right with Cannon, because Derek says he's getting B's and C's now instead of failing everything. He has to check in with his counselor twice a week and take these anger management classes every Thursday night. Some parents tried to get Cannon kicked out of town completely, but the judge said he was following all his requirements and deserved a chance to fix his mistakes. Andrea keeps winning awards for her articles about student safety, and she uses every speech to talk about helping kids instead of just punishing them when they mess up. Man, that was such a good time sharing this little journey with you all. Appreciate you letting me bring a bit of excitement into your day. Until we meet again, subscribe for more content like this.